The fog in Blackwood Harbor didn't just roll in, it settled. It clung to the cobblestones like a secret that refused to be told. It was late October, and the tourists had long since packed up their colorful umbrellas, leaving the town to its locals and its ghosts. Usually by 7 in the morning, the scent of salt and wood smoke would be overpowered by the smell of fresh bread from the harbor bakery. But on this particular Tuesday, the air felt different. It was sharper, still. And for the first time in 20 years, the chimney of the manor house on the cliff was cold. Welcome to Whisper Theory. Evelyn Moore, the town archivist, knew more about Blackwood's history than the mayor himself. At precisely 8 o'clock, she adjusted her wool scarf and stood on the corner of High Street. Her gray eyes narrowed as she looked up toward the cliffs. Specifically, she was looking at Crowe Manor. Mr. Alistair Crowe, the town's reclusive antiquarian, was a man of obsessive precision. At 7 in the morning, the heavy velvet drapes of the east parlor would always part. At 7:15, the chimney would belch its first plume of white smoke. Today, the chimney was dead. The drapes were sealed tight. The house sat on the cliff edge like a skull with its eyes shut. Thomas, the young postman, stopped beside her. He was staring up at the manor, shifting his weight nervously. He asked if it wasn't odd. Evelyn replied that it was more than odd. Alistair Crowe hadn't missed a morning routine since the storm of '98. Thomas mentioned that yesterday's parcel was still wedged in the gate. He thought perhaps Mr. Crowe had gone away, but Evelyn knew the truth. Mr. Crowe never went away. He was a man who hoarded artifacts, money, and grudges. Evelyn felt a prickle at the back of her neck, a sense of disorder that demanded correction. She decided they ought to knock. The walk up the cliff path was steep. By the time they reached the iron gates, Dr. Sterling's old car was already pulling up. The weary doctor told Evelyn that a neighbor had called him, concerned about the lack of light in the house the previous night. Evelyn murmured that in a town this small, privacy was just a polite fiction. The front door of the manor was unlocked. That was the first wrong thing. Alistair Crowe trusted no one. He had 3 locks on every door. For the main entrance to be unlatched was as shocking as a scream. They entered together. The hallway smelled of old paper, beeswax, and something faintly metallic. They found him in the study. Alistair Crowe sat in his leather-winged chair, facing the cold fireplace. A half-empty glass of brandy sat nearby. His head was tipped back, his eyes half open, staring at the ceiling moldings. He was dead. There was no violence in the room, no overturned furniture, no blood, just a man who had simply stopped being. Dr. Sterling sighed, stepping forward to check for a pulse he knew wasn't there. He suggested heart failure, noting the man was nearly 80. Evelyn didn't move toward the body. Instead, she looked at the room. She looked at the way the shadows fell across the rug. She looked at the heavy velvet curtains, pinned shut with a strange desperation. And then she saw it. On the floor near the curtain hem lay a pocket watch. The glass was shattered and the hands were frozen. But it wasn't the broken glass that caught Evelyn's attention. It was the time. The watch had stopped at 3 o'clock, but Evelyn knew for a fact that Alistair Crowe wound his clocks every single evening at 6. Evelyn looked at the unlatched door, then back to the doctor. She realized then that time didn't just run out for Mr. Crowe. Someone had stopped it. Alistair Crowe was a man who lived his life behind 3 deadbolts and a wrought iron gate. He didn't like visitors. He didn't like surprises. And he certainly didn't leave his front door unlocked. Yet when he died, the door was open, and the only thing missing from his study wasn't money or artifacts. It was the truth. The police called it a tragedy. Evelyn Moore called it a stage play, and the curtain had just gone up. News travels fast in Blackwood Harbor, usually faster than the coastal winds. By the time Constable Green arrived, looking flushed and overwhelmed, half the town was already peering over the cliff edge. Inside the study, the air was thick with official procedure. The flash of a camera illuminated the dusty corners, making the shadows jump. Constable Green, a good-natured man who usually dealt with noise complaints and lost dogs, looked at the body of Mr. Crowe with palpable relief. He scribbled in his notebook, noting that Dr. Sterling believed it was heart failure, which was to be expected at 80. Evelyn stood by the bookshelf, her hands clasped tightly together. She wasn't looking at the body. She was looking at the side table next to the armchair. She asked the constable if it was expected for a man of obsessive habits to change his routine on the day he died. Green looked up, confused. Evelyn pointed a gloved finger at the brandy decanter. Alistair drank 1 glass of cognac every evening, exactly 1. The glass was there, sitting on the table, but Evelyn told them to look at the coaster. The coaster was bone dry, but beside it, directly on the polished mahogany wood, was a faint, circular stain. Evelyn murmured that someone had moved the glass. She explained that Alistair was terrified of ruining the finish on his antique furniture. He would never set a glass on the bare wood. Never. This meant someone else had been in the room, someone who didn't know the rules or someone who didn't care. While Evelyn catalogued the inconsistencies in the silent manner, the village below was filling the silence with noise. The Blackwood Bakery was the unofficial headquarters for local speculation. Mrs. Higgins, the owner, was already dispensing theories along with her sourdough loaves. She told a captivated audience that she always knew the house was cursed. A customer, Mrs. Gable, leaned in, whispering that she heard the door was unlocked. The rumors swirled like the fog outside. Some said he fell. Some said he was frightened to death. But the darker whispers spoke of family. They spoke of Clara, the artist niece he had cut off years ago. Bad blood, the villagers agreed, doesn't dry up, it just gets sticky. Back at the manor, the body was being wheeled out. The room felt emptier, yet heavier. Evelyn walked to the fireplace. It was cold as it had been all morning, but something in the grate caught her eye. It wasn't just ash. It was the distinct, flaky gray of burnt paper. She crouched down. Alistair Crowe was a meticulous filer. He didn't burn papers. He archived them. She called out to the constable. He sighed, eager to leave, but Evelyn insisted. She used the fireplace poker to gently shift a piece of charred wood. Underneath lay a tiny scrap of paper that had escaped the flames. It was blue, robin's egg blue. Evelyn whispered that it was a letter. Someone had received a letter they didn't want anyone else to read. Evelyn stood up, dusting off her hands. The glass was moved. The watch was stopped. The door was unlocked, and a letter was burned. She turned to face the window, looking out at the gray sea. Mr. Crowe didn't die of a failing heart. He died because he let the wrong person in. And down in the harbor, near the old boat repair shop, a young woman with paint-stained hands was watching the ambulance drive away. She wasn't crying. She was waiting. Fire is supposed to erase history. It consumes paper, ink, and secrets, leaving behind nothing but gray dust. But Evelyn Moore knew that fire is rarely thorough. It is impatient. And in its haste, it often leaves behind the most dangerous fragments of the truth. The scrap of blue paper found in Alistair Crowe's fireplace was no bigger than a thumbprint, but in the monochrome gray of Blackwood Harbor, that robin's egg blue was as loud as a gunshot. Evelyn did not go straight to the police station with her evidence. In her experience, Constable Green would simply file the scrap away in a plastic bag and lose it in a drawer. Instead, she went to the one place where paper could still speak, the town archives. She sat at her heavy oak desk, the smell of old parchment grounding her. She wasn't analyzing the handwriting. There wasn't enough of it left. She was analyzing the texture. It was heavy stock, expensive and textured with a linen finish. This wasn't office supply paper. This was personal stationery. And in a town where most people communicated by telephone or quick scrawls on receipt backs, stationery like this belonged to a very short list of people. But before she could chase the paper, she had to chase the man who might have seen it arrive. Silas Vane. Silas was the caretaker of the Crowe estate, though caretaker was a generous term. He was a man woven from driftwood and resentment, who spent his days trimming the hedges that blocked the manor from view, and his nights drinking dark ale at the harbor pub. If anyone had approached the house before the murder, Silas would have seen them, or he would have made it his business to ignore them. Evelyn found him down by the dry docks, scraping barnacles off the hull of a fishing trawler. He didn't look up when she approached. The sound of metal scraping against wood filled the air, setting Evelyn's teeth on edge. She waited until he paused to wipe his brow. She asked him plainly if he had been at the manor on Monday night. Silas spat on the ground, missing her shoe by an inch. He told her he finished his rounds at 6. He claimed the house was quiet, just the way the old man liked it. Evelyn stepped closer, not intimidated by his size or his temper. She reminded him that Alistair Crowe was terrified of intruders. If a stranger had walked up that gravel path, the dogs would have barked. But the dogs had been silent. That meant the visitor was someone the dogs knew, or someone Silas had let in. Silas stopped scraping. He looked at Evelyn with eyes that were bloodshot and wary. He admitted that he didn't let anyone in, but he did see something. He saw the curtains. Usually, Alistair kept the front parlor sealed tight, but on Monday afternoon, around 4 o'clock, the old man had been standing at the window. He wasn't reading. He wasn't working. He was watching the road. Silas said Alistair looked like a man waiting for a storm. He looked afraid. Evelyn thanked him, though Silas didn't acknowledge it. As she walked back toward the town center, the pieces began to click into a grim picture. Alistair Crowe, a man who controlled every second of his life, was waiting for someone he feared. He had unlocked the door for them. And then he had burned their letter. Evelyn passed the art supply shop on Main Street. In the window, a display of high-end sketching paper caught the afternoon light. There, in the center of the arrangement, was a pad of heavy, linen-textured paper. The color was unmistakable, robin's egg blue. Evelyn stopped cold. She knew who bought that paper. She knew who used it for charcoal sketches and angry letters home. It was Clara, the estranged niece, the artist who had supposedly left town years ago. But as Evelyn stared at the blue paper, she realized that Clara hadn't just returned to Blackwood Harbor. She had returned to the manor, and she had been the last person Alistair Crowe ever expected to see. The old sail loft stood at the very edge of the harbor, a building that smelled permanently of turpentine and damp wood. It was a place for transients, for people who didn't want to be found, and for artists who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Evelyn Moore knew that Clara had been staying there for 3 weeks. In a town like Blackwood Harbor, anonymity was a luxury no one could afford, especially not a woman with the Crowe family eyes. Evelyn climbed the creaking wooden stairs. The door to the loft was ajar. Inside, the space was chaotic. Canvases were stacked against the walls, capturing the angry, churning gray of the sea. In the center of the room stood Clara. She was no longer the frightened girl who had run away 10 years ago. She was a woman now, with sharp features and paint-stained hands. She was scrubbing a palette knife with a rag, the motion violent and repetitive. Evelyn knocked on the doorframe. Clara froze, then turned slowly. Her eyes widened not with surprise but with resignation. She didn't ask why Evelyn was there. She simply set the knife down. Evelyn walked into the room, her gaze sweeping over the art supplies scattered on the table. Tubes of oil paint, brushes, and there, sitting openly on a stool, was a sketchpad. The cover was worn, but the paper inside was unmistakable. Heavy, linen-textured, and robin's egg blue. Evelyn spoke softly. She mentioned that the police were looking for a stranger, a drifter perhaps. But Evelyn knew that Alistair Crowe didn't open his door for drifters. He opened it for family. She pointed to the sketchpad. She told Clara that she had found a piece of that paper in Alistair's fireplace. It was burnt but not destroyed. Clara's shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving her looking small and tired against the backdrop of her storm-tossed paintings. She admitted it. She had written to him. She had sent the letter 3 days ago. She told Evelyn that she was tired of the silence. She wanted to make peace, not for his sake, but for her own. She wanted to know if he had any regret in him at all. Evelyn asked the question that mattered most. She asked if Clara had gone to the manor on Monday night. Clara hesitated. She looked at her hands, stained with crimson paint that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. She whispered that she had went. She walked up the cliff path around 6 o'clock. She expected the gate to be locked. She expected to have to ring the bell and be turned away by Silas or the dogs. But the gate was open, and when she reached the front door, it was unlatched. Evelyn stepped closer. This was the timeline she needed. If Clara was there at 6, she was there when Alistair was likely dying. Evelyn asked what happened next. Clara shook her head rapidly. She said she didn't go in. She stepped into the hallway just inside the threshold. The house felt wrong. It was too quiet. But then she heard something. It wasn't silence. It was a voice. Alistair was speaking. He wasn't alone. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She asked who he was speaking to. Clara looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and vindication. She said she didn't see him, but she heard the tone. It was angry. Alistair was pleading, sounding desperate, which was a tone she had never heard from him in her life. And the other voice, the man's voice, was cold. Clara got scared. She thought she had walked into something she shouldn't see. So she ran. She ran back down the path and didn't stop until she reached the harbor. Evelyn processed this. A man's voice, an argument, and Alistair Crowe, the tyrant of Blackwood, pleading. Evelyn asked if Clara recognized the voice. Clara nodded slowly. She said she hadn't heard it in years, not since they were children playing on the beach. It was sophisticated, smooth, and arrogant. It was Julian, Alistair's nephew, the golden boy who had left for the city and swore he'd never come back. Evelyn looked out the loft window toward the road that led out of town. If Julian Crowe was back in Blackwood Harbor, he hadn't come for a family reunion. He had come for an inheritance. And unlike Clara, Julian wasn't the type to ask politely. Julian Crowe was everything Blackwood Harbor was not. He was polished, expensive, and superficial. While the rest of the town was built from granite and sea salt, Julian seemed to be constructed entirely of silk ties and ambition. He had left the harbor 15 years ago, vowing to trade the fog for the city lights, and by all accounts he had succeeded. But success in the city often requires a constant stream of capital, and capital was exactly what Alistair Crowe had been hoarding in his cliffside fortress. Evelyn found Julian in the lounge of the Grandview Hotel, the only establishment in town that served cocktails with proper ice. He was sitting by the window, nursing a whiskey, looking out at the ocean with a bored expression. He didn't look like a grieving nephew. He looked like a man waiting for a bank transfer. Evelyn approached his table. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. Julian looked at her, his eyebrows arching in a display of mock surprise. He greeted her with a smooth, practiced charm, calling her the keeper of the town's secrets. Evelyn didn't smile. She told him that she wasn't interested in keeping secrets today. She was interested in the argument he had with his uncle on the night of the murder. Julian's smile faltered, just for a second, before he took a slow sip of his drink. He set the glass down with a sharp click. He asked who had been telling stories. Evelyn told him it didn't matter who heard it. What mattered was that he was in the house, demanding money from a man who would be dead an hour later. Julian sighed, dropping the pretense. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He admitted it. He was there. He needed a bridge loan for a venture in the city, a sure thing that had hit a temporary snag. He went to Alistair because family is supposed to help family, but the old man had laughed at him. Evelyn watched his face closely. She asked what time he left. Julian shrugged. He said he stormed out around 6:30. He claimed Alistair was alive and well, sitting in his chair, drinking that expensive brandy and gloating about his fortune. Julian insisted he didn't touch him. He simply slammed the door and walked back to town. Evelyn's mind raced. The timeline was getting crowded. The watch had stopped at 3. Clara heard the argument around 6. Julian claimed he left at 6:30. If Julian was telling the truth, the watch was a lie. Alistair couldn't have broken it at 3 in the afternoon if he was arguing with his nephew at sunset. Evelyn pressed him. She asked if Alistair seemed anxious. Silas had mentioned fear. Clara had mentioned desperation. Julian scoffed. He said Alistair wasn't afraid. He was distracted. He kept checking the mantel clock. Every few minutes his eyes would dart to the time. He was waiting for something or someone, and he wanted Julian gone before they arrived. This was a new piece of the puzzle. Alistair Crowe wasn't just a victim waiting to die. He was a host waiting for an appointment. Julian hadn't been the main event. He was just an inconvenience. Evelyn stood up. She told Julian not to leave town. Julian laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. He told her he couldn't leave even if he wanted to. Alistair had claimed he was cash poor. He claimed the estate was empty, that the money was gone. Julian was staying until the will was read because he didn't believe the old man for a second. Evelyn walked out of the hotel into the cooling night air. The timeline was broken. The watch was a decoy. And somewhere in that house, there was a record of where the money had gone. But as she walked past the town square, she noticed a light on in the record's office. Someone was inside the municipal building, accessing the property deeds. And at this hour, the only people with keys were the mayor, the janitor, and the town archivist. But Evelyn was standing outside, which meant someone had stolen her spare key. The Blackwood Harbor Municipal Archives were Evelyn Moore's domain. She knew the squeak of every floorboard and the smell of every dusty file box. Standing outside in the cool night air, seeing the flashlight beam dancing inside the darkened building, felt less like a burglary and more like a violation of sacred ground. Evelyn didn't call the police. She didn't scream. She simply took her own set of iron keys from her purse, walked up the steps, and quietly unlocked the heavy oak door. She slipped inside, the silence of the building wrapping around her. The intruder was in the back room, the section dedicated to property deeds and land transfers. Evelyn moved through the shadows, her sensible shoes making no sound on the linoleum. She reached the doorway and flipped the light switch. The figure at the filing cabinet froze. It wasn't a stranger. It was Silas Vane. The caretaker dropped a heavy folder, the papers spilling across the floor like white leaves. He looked terrified. For a man who could snap a fence post in two, he shrank under Evelyn's gaze. She didn't ask him what he was doing. It was obvious. He was looking for the Crowe file. She asked him why. Silas stammered, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting Constable Green to burst in. He admitted that he wasn't stealing. He was checking. He claimed that Alistair had promised him the gatehouse. For 20 years, Silas had trimmed the hedges and kept the secrets, and Alistair had sworn that upon his death, the deed to the small cottage by the road would be transferred to Silas's name. But after the body was found, Silas got a bad feeling. He wanted to see the paper with his own eyes. Evelyn stepped forward and knelt to pick up the scattered documents. She told Silas that looking for a will in a land deed office was foolish. But Silas shook his head. He wasn't looking for a will. He was looking to see if Alistair still owned the land at all. Silas told Evelyn that for the past month, Alistair had been acting strange. He was making phone calls late at night. He was meeting with a solicitor from the city, a man Silas didn't recognize. And Julian was right. Alistair had been saying the money was gone. Silas feared that Alistair had sold the gatehouse out from under him before he even had the chance to inherit it. Evelyn picked up the file Silas had dropped. It was the master deed for the Crowe estate. She opened it, her eyes scanning the recent entries. Her breath caught in her throat. Silas was right to be worried, but it wasn't just the gatehouse. According to the records, Alistair Crowe had been systematically liquidating his assets for 6 months. He had sold the timber rights on the North Ridge. He had sold the rental cottages near the wharf. And most shockingly, on the very morning of his death, a transfer had been filed for the manor house itself. Evelyn looked at the date. Monday morning, the day he died. Alistair Crowe had signed over his entire ancestral home to a shell company called Apex Holdings. He hadn't just disinherited Julian and Clara. He had erased their legacy entirely. She looked up at Silas. She asked if he knew who was behind Apex Holdings. Silas shook his head blankly. He was just a gardener. He didn't know about shell companies. He just knew that he was homeless. Evelyn realized then why Alistair had been checking the clock. He wasn't waiting for a killer. He was waiting for the final confirmation that the sale had gone through. He was a man who was about to flee. He had liquidated everything, packed his life into a bank account, and was planning to disappear before the family vultures could pick his bones clean. But someone had found out. Someone knew that the money wasn't gone, but rather it was liquid, accessible, and sitting in a place where a dead man couldn't protect it. Evelyn dismissed Silas, telling him to go home and stay quiet. As he scurried away, she looked closely at the transfer document again. The notary stamp at the bottom was fresh. It belonged to a local official, a man who verified signatures and witnessed deeds, a man who Evelyn had trusted earlier that morning. The signature belonged to Thomas, the postman. But Thomas wasn't just a postman. In a town this small, he was also the licensed notary public. And he had been at the gate that morning, shifting his weight, looking at the house with knowing eyes. The Blackwood Harbor post office was usually a place of mundane predictability. It smelled of brown paper, stamp glue, and damp wool. Thomas, the young postman with the nervous smile, was behind the counter, sorting the morning mail into neat little stacks. He looked like a man whose biggest worry was a paper cut, but Evelyn Moore knew better. She knew that beneath his uniform, Thomas carried the weight of a lie that was worth a fortune. Evelyn walked in just as the clock struck 9. She didn't queue. She walked straight to the counter and placed the photocopy of the property deed on the wood. The sound of the paper hitting the surface was soft, but to Thomas, it must have sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. He looked at the document. He looked at the signature. And then he looked at Evelyn, his face draining of color. Evelyn spoke quietly. She told him that perjury was a serious offense, but being an accessory to fraud, or worse, murder, was a life sentence. She reminded him of their conversation at the gate yesterday morning, where he claimed he hadn't seen Alistair Crowe. He had lied. The notary stamp on the deed was dated Monday morning. Thomas hadn't just left a parcel at the gate. He had been invited inside. Thomas crumpled. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was just a local boy who had gotten caught in a riptide. He pulled the grate down over the window, flipping the sign to closed. In the dim light of the back room, he confessed. He admitted he was there. Alistair had called him early Monday morning, offering him £500 cash just to come up and witness a signature. For a postman, that was 3 months' wages. Thomas went. He found Alistair in the study, manic and energetic. The old man wasn't sick. He wasn't dying. He was packing. Evelyn seized on that detail. Packing. Thomas nodded eagerly. He said there were suitcases by the door. Alistair was selling everything. The house, the land, the timber rights, to this Apex Holdings. He told Thomas he was leaving Blackwood Harbor forever. He said he was finally going to see the world, and he wasn't taking his vulture family with him. He was laughing about it. He seemed liberated. Evelyn asked the crucial question, was anyone else there? Thomas hesitated. He said he didn't see anyone else, but he heard movements upstairs. Heavy footsteps. Alistair had dismissed it, saying it was just the wind, but Thomas knew the sound of old floorboards. Someone was on the second floor. Someone who was packing the bags while Alistair signed the papers downstairs. Evelyn asked about the money. If Alistair sold the house on Monday, where did the funds go? Thomas revealed the final piece of the puzzle. He said Alistair didn't want a bank transfer. He didn't trust banks anymore. The deal with Apex Holdings was peculiar. Thomas saw a ledger on the desk. The payment wasn't in numbers, it was in assets, diamonds, bearer bonds, things that could be carried in a pocket and couldn't be traced. Evelyn thanked him, leaving Thomas shivering in the safety of his post office. She walked back out into the fog. The narrative had shifted completely. Alistair Crowe wasn't a victim of a break-in. He was a man attempting a getaway. He had liquidated his empire into a portable fortune. But he never made it out the door. The stopped watch at 3 p.m. was a lie. The argument with Julian at 6:30 p.m. was real. But the killer hadn't struck then. The killer had waited. They had waited until the bags were packed and the deed was signed. They had waited until the fortune was portable. Evelyn realized that the person upstairs wasn't a servant. It was a partner. Alistair Crowe, the man who trusted no one, had believed he was running away with someone. But that someone had decided it was much more profitable to leave alone. And Evelyn knew exactly where a person would go if they needed to leave Blackwood Harbor with a bag full of diamonds without being seen. They wouldn't take the road. They would take the water. The harbor at night was a different world. It was a labyrinth of creaking masts, slapping water, and the smell of diesel and dead fish. The fog had thickened, turning the rows of docked boats into ghostly silhouettes. Evelyn Moore moved along the wooden jetty, her flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the mist. She wasn't looking for a fishing trawler or a dinghy. She was looking for something faster, something capable of crossing the channel in a single night. She knew that Dr. Sterling owned a boat. He called it the Remedy, a small, sleek cabin cruiser that he claimed was for weekend fishing trips, though Evelyn had never seen him bring back a single fish. The boat was moored at the far end of the marina, away from the prying eyes of the main dock. Evelyn stepped onto the fiberglass deck. The boat rocked gently under her weight. The cabin door was padlocked, but the lock was cheap, rusted from the salt air. Evelyn didn't have bolt cutters, but she had something better: patience and a hairpin. It took her 2 minutes to spring the latch. She slid the cabin door open and descended into the dark belly of the boat. It smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic. Evelyn swept her light across the small space. There was a narrow bunk, a tiny kitchenette, and a table bolted to the floor. It looked innocent enough, but Evelyn knelt and shone the light under the bunk. There, jammed into the tight space against the hull, were two large leather suitcases. She pulled them out. They were heavy. The leather was embossed with the initials AC. Alistair Crowe. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Thomas hadn't lied. Alistair really had packed. He had been ready to leave. Evelyn unbuckled the straps of the first case. It was filled with clothes, suits, silk shirts, shoes wrapped in velvet bags. It was a wardrobe for a new life. She opened the second case. It was empty. The lining had been slashed open. The pockets had been turned out. Whatever portable fortune Alistair had converted his estate into, the diamonds, the bearer bonds, was gone. Evelyn sat back on her heels. The narrative was reshaping itself again. Alistair hadn't been killed by an intruder who stumbled upon him. He had been killed by his partner. The person who was supposed to sail him to freedom had decided that the diamonds would take up less space than the old man. But why was the luggage here? Why hadn't the killer disposed of it? "Because he hasn't had time," Evelyn whispered to the damp air. She stood up and moved to the small kitchenette counter. There was a medical bag sitting there. It wasn't the battered leather one Dr. Sterling took on house calls. This was a canvas duffel. Evelyn unzipped it. Inside, she didn't find diamonds. She found the tools of a manufactured death. A vial of potassium chloride, untraceable if you don't look for it, but deadly enough to stop a heart instantly. A stack of blank death certificates, one of them already practiced on. And tucked into the side pocket, a pair of heavy rubber gloves stained with soot. Soot from a fireplace. Evelyn realized the doctor hadn't just pronounced Alistair dead. He had staged the scene. He had burned the letter from Clara to confuse the timeline. He had smashed the watch to create a false alibi. And he had moved the brandy glass to hide the fact that Alistair had been drugged before the final dose. But where were the diamonds? A creak on the deck above her made Evelyn freeze. The boat shifted, tilting slightly as weight was applied to the stern. Someone had stepped on board. Evelyn clicked off her flashlight. The darkness was absolute. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the steps leading down to the cabin. There was no way out. She was trapped in the belly of the Remedy, and the doctor had come to check on his patient. The beam of a flashlight in a dark room is a violent thing. When the cabin light flicked on, it didn't just illuminate the space, it assaulted it. Evelyn Moore raised a hand to shield her eyes, but she didn't retreat. She stood firmly beside the open suitcase, the evidence of a lifetime of greed spilled out at her feet. Dr. Arthur Sterling stood at the bottom of the stairs. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding his medical bag, the one he took on house calls, clutching it with knuckles that were white with tension. He looked older than he had that morning. His face was gray, drawn, and utterly resigned. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a man who had been awake for 3 days straight. He looked at Evelyn, then at the suitcase, and finally at the vial of potassium chloride on the counter. He didn't shout. He just sighed, a long, shuddering exhale that sounded like air escaping a tire. Evelyn spoke first. She kept her voice level, devoid of the fear that was currently freezing her blood. She told him that she knew. She knew Alistair wasn't murdered by an intruder. He was murdered by his exit strategy. Sterling closed the cabin door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut was soft, but final. He walked past Evelyn and poured himself a glass of water from the tap, his movements slow and deliberate. He admitted it without a fight. He said Alistair had come to him a month ago. The old man was terrified of losing his fortune to debts and taxes. He wanted to liquidate, disappear, and live out his days in anonymity on the coast of Spain. He needed a doctor to certify him fit for travel and a boat to get him across the channel without a passport. Evelyn pieced the rest together. She said that Alistair trusted him. He trusted him to pilot the boat. He trusted him with the location of the assets, and that was his mistake. Sterling turned, leaning against the small counter. He looked at Evelyn with sad, tired eyes. He said that Alistair Crowe was a monster. He was leaving his niece and nephew with nothing but legal fees. He was taking millions out of the town that had made him rich. Sterling asked Evelyn if she knew how much a country doctor makes. He asked if she knew about the debts he had accrued trying to keep his own practice afloat. Evelyn nodded. Motive is rarely original. It is usually money, desperation, or both. She gestured to the empty suitcase. She asked where the diamonds were. Sterling patted his medical bag. He said they were safe. He said they were supposed to be his retirement. He had planned it perfectly. He went to the house on Monday evening to give Alistair a sedative for the journey. But then he realized something. A dead man doesn't need a retirement fund. And a doctor knows exactly how to make a heart stop without leaving a bruise. He told Evelyn that it was easy. Alistair was already drugged. He didn't feel a thing. Sterling injected the potassium, waited for the pulse to stop, and then set the stage. He smashed the watch. He burned Clara's letter to confuse the timeline. He unlocked the door to suggest an intruder. It was a perfect death until Evelyn Moore decided to look at the coaster. Evelyn straightened her spine. She told him that it was over. The police would find the suitcases. Thomas had already confessed. There was nowhere left to run. Sterling looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something dangerous crossed his face. He said there was always somewhere to run. The ocean is vast, and it is very good at keeping secrets. He reached past her and turned the key in the ignition panel. The boat's engine roared to life beneath their feet, a deep, vibrating growl that shook the floorboards. Sterling looked at Evelyn with a chilling calmness. He told her that he hadn't planned on 2 passengers tonight. But accidents happen at sea all the time. A slip on a wet deck, a fall overboard. He said it would be tragic, losing the town's beloved archivist to the cold, dark water. He moved to the ladder, blocking the only exit. He told her to sit down. They had a long trip ahead of them. The boat lurched as the mooring lines were cast off, and Evelyn Moore felt the sickening sway of the hull as the Remedy began to pull away from the safety of the harbor. The engine of the Remedy roared, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the soles of Evelyn's shoes. Dr. Sterling climbed the short ladder to the deck. his silhouette framed against the swirling fog. He didn't lock the cabin door. He didn't need to. They were already 100 yards out, and the water of Blackwood Harbor was freezing, dark, and lethal. He assumed Evelyn Moore, the 60-year-old archivist with the sensible shoes, would sit quietly and wait for her end. That was his final mistake. Evelyn waited until she felt the boat bank sharply to the left, signaling that Sterling was busy navigating the treacherous breakwater rocks. She didn't sit. She lunged for the emergency locker mounted on the bulkhead. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, adrenaline making her hands shake. The metal door swung open. Inside, nestled in foam, was a heavy orange flare gun. She grabbed it. It was cold and heavy, a tool designed to save lives, now repurposed to save just one. She cracked the barrel open, checked the cartridge, and snapped it shut. Above her, the engine pitch changed. Sterling was throttling down to navigate the narrow channel. Evelyn climbed the ladder. She didn't try to be quiet. She threw the hatch open. Sterling spun around from the wheel, his face twisting in shock. He reached for her, abandoning the controls. "Sit down," he screamed over the wind. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She didn't aim at him. She aimed straight up into the thick, suffocating blanket of fog and pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred her arm, but the result was blinding. A streak of magnesium red tore through the night, sizzling as it arched high above the harbor. It hung there, burning with a fierce, apocalyptic light, turning the gray fog into a blood-red canopy. Sterling stared up at the light, his face illuminated in the crimson glow. He knew what that meant. In a harbor town, a distress flare is a summons. Every eye on the docks, every Coast Guard lookout, and every patrolling constable would be looking exactly at them. "You foolish woman," Sterling whispered, the fight draining out of him as the red light began to drift down. The sound of sirens cut through the fog from the shore. Then, the deep, powerful thrum of the harbor patrol boat's engine grew louder, approaching fast. Sterling slumped against the wheel. He didn't try to run. There is nowhere to run when the ocean is lit up like a stage. 3 days later, the fog had finally lifted from Blackwood Harbor. The arrest of Dr. Arthur Sterling was the kind of scandal that would fuel the town's gossip for a decade. The diamonds were recovered from his medical bag, returned to the estate, which was now, finally, being managed properly. Evelyn Moore sat in the warm, dusty silence of the archives. She was filing a new newspaper clipping into the town records. The headline read, "Local Doctor Arrested in £1 million Embezzlement Scheme." The door opened and Clara walked in. She looked different. The tension that had held her shoulders tight for weeks was gone. She was holding a sketchbook. "I wanted to say goodbye," Clara said softly. "And thank you." "You're leaving?" Evelyn asked, closing the file. Clara shook her head, smiling. "No, I'm moving into the manor. The lawyers say it will take months to sort out the inheritance, but it's my home. I'm going to open the curtains. I'm going to paint in the garden. I think the house needs a bit of color, don't you?" Evelyn smiled. "I think that sounds perfect." Clara placed a small drawing on Evelyn's desk. It was a charcoal sketch of the harbor at sunrise, the light breaking through the clouds. It was messy, chaotic, and beautiful. "He thought he could erase us," Clara said, looking at the drawing. "He thought if he burned the papers and sold the house, we wouldn't exist anymore. but he forgot something. "What's that?" Evelyn asked. "You can't erase history," Clara said. "Not when someone is keeping the records." Clara left, the bell above the door chiming brightly. Evelyn Moore sat alone in the archives, surrounded by the stories of the living and the dead. She picked up her pen, opened the ledger for the year, and wrote one final entry for the Crowe case. Then she turned off the lamp, leaving the ghosts of Blackwood Harbor to rest in the dark. Because in this town, the truth always finds a way to the surface. You just have to know where to look.